Gallery. Apologies for the delay, but we're ready to get going now. You're very welcome to our 80th anniversary collection exhibition featuring new acquisitions, which include some incredible works here by Michael Beirne. We're excited to be collaborating with Poetry Ireland on our first in a series of poetry encounters where 4 artists in the exhibition are linked up with poets who will read from their work, and together they will share and exchange insights together. I'm delighted to welcome Liz Kelly of Poetry Ireland, who will introduce Jess McKinney in a moment, and we're really happy to have her here today. Firstly, may I introduce Michael Beirne. You studied fine art at the Crawford School of Art in Cork. He's had solo exhibitions of his work at the David Cunningham projects in San Francisco, the Sligo Arts Centre, our Butler Gallery in 2005, and Temple Bar Galleries and Studios Dublin. He's been selected in various group exhibitions. He was commissioned by the Arts Council to produce work for the touring school show Heroes. And apart from the Arts Council, his work is included in the collections of the Arts Council, Butler Gallery, Crawford Municipal Art Gallery, as well as several significant private collections in Ireland and abroad. Michael is represented by the Butler Gallery in Dublin. Pass you on to Liz and enjoy the afternoon.
Thank you very much, Anna, and to everybody in the Butler Gallery for having us today, and to you as well for your patience this afternoon. It's lovely to see such a great gathering of people who are interested and engaged with both art forms this afternoon. And what a beautiful day it is in Kilkenny. You arranged the weather beautifully for us again. Jess McKinney is one of a generation of amazingly talented, younger early career poets who have come to the fore in the last couple of years. And she is from Inishowen in County Donegal, Old Gookish. She completed her MA in Poetry in Queen's in 2020, and she was awarded the Irish Chair of Poetry Student Award for that. In 2021, she took part in Daedalus Press Mentorship Programme and the Seamus McKinney Centre Poetry Summer School. Her writing has appeared in the Belfield Literary Review, The Moth, Stinging Fly, Banshee, Sand, Channel, Abridged, The Poetry Jukebox, and New Ireland Anthology, The New Frontier, Writing from the Irish Border, and she has upcoming work in the Cormorant. Her debut pamphlet, Weeding, was published by Hazel Press in September 2021 and launched the London Review Bookshop, where it has remained on the bestseller list for several weeks. She was additionally shortlisted for the Patrick Kavanagh Poetry Award in 2021 and the Saboteur Awards in 2022, and most recently she took part or was selected for Poetry Ireland's own introduction series in 2022 as one of the top young emerging poets in Ireland. So we are absolutely delighted to present Jess McKinney here this afternoon and intrigued by the possibilities of this conversation with Michael Beirne. So over to you, Jess. We've asked Jess to open a couple of poems this afternoon.
Oh, thank you so much for the gorgeous introductions and for having us here, and thank you, Michael, for being open to this conversation. Thank you all for coming along. It's my first time back in Kilkenny since the dreaded COVID, and my first time in this beautiful gallery, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. Visual art and ekphrastic writing are big parts of my process, which is writing in response to visual art, films, pre-existing books, that sort of thing. My pamphlet, Weeding, came out in 21 with a gorgeous press called Hazel Press. They're environmentally based. It's all recycled materials, eco-friendly inks and that sort of thing. And to get us started, I thought I might read 2 poems and then delve into some conversation with your good self. The first one I read today is a poem called Prospect Cottage, and it's after one of my absolute favorite artists in the world. You'll all probably be very familiar with Derek Yarman. He was an environmentalist, visual artist, and most importantly, a filmmaker. Prospect Cottage. What was originally a Victorian fisherman's hut on the shingle shores of Kent near Dungeness Nuclear Power Station, on the very doorstep of all the finest fish and chips in all England, became a hideaway choked with clematis montana, surrounded by small circles of flint, standing stones, dolmens and driftwood from the beach hid his timber walls drowned in gallons of pitch black paint, complete with yellow frames which sting hot like a bee in summer. Like all great works of art, he He knew the setting mattered, knew that paradise haunts some gardens while others end up like bad children. If his home was going to shelter the whole night at rest, it ought to sleep standing up, with its back to the rain until one wall starts speaking poetry and the rising sun knocks like an old friend. If I could give any piece of advice today, it would be go home and Google a picture of the Prospect Cottage. It was something that he built in the later years of his life. It's kind of a symbol of defiance. It was in the shadow of the nuclear power station in Dungeness, and it's made out of driftwood and like found materials, and in this kind of barren landscape he grew this beautiful garden, and it absolutely thrived against the kind of bleak landscape, and it just is really a sight to behold. And there really is a big poem written on the side of the house, and it's absolutely gorgeous. So I thought that might be a nice one to open with. The next one I thought I'd read, because I saw that your description of one of your paintings is very, very interesting, mentions Mrs. Havisham, and that kind of got me thinking about this one, which is written after Virginia Woolf and her book Orlando. It's probably cheating, writing after other books that already exist, but I do it all the time. Orlando. I was once in love with a man who died for a week and took death sleeping in small doses. He was ground out of granite and rainbow, a mixture of brown earth and blue blood. He slept with a gorse bush under his pillow and became infected with the pollen of literature. He had the shapeliest legs of any known nobleman. In his eyes did me a violence, drenched violets. He loved to feel the earth's spine beneath him, trusted only elk hounds and rose bushes. He matured into womanhood. Under the watch of three sisters, purity, chastity, and modesty, she was both 36 and 300 and outlived all of her many lovers. She found a husband on the moors with an ear to ground and a wedding ring twined from root. She was an ambassador, duke, patroness of letters, and straddled the gulf of time with finesse. She knew all about the secret transaction of poetry and carried her life's work sewn into her dress. Oh, thank you. And now we're on to the good bit. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today, Michael.
Oh, yeah.
And to be here basking in front of these gorgeous pieces, which before I got here, I was trying to like zoom in on the little pictures that were up online. And there's really nothing that beats like being in the actual gallery space itself and like getting to like look well and close at the pictures. And I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions, if that's all right, about your pieces today, because I feel like there is actually quite a lot of kinship in the things that we're interested in thematically, which really delighted and excited me about coming here to talk to you today. So I was really particularly taken with Dogman and the first untitled piece. This is absolutely incredible. It's a very kind of like mesmerizing, but like kind of slightly uncanny landscape. And it was just the different elements of it and how it was all kind of tied together. I was kind of interested in your use of materials, because that's when I was reading up about you online, that would seem to be something that came up and up again. Your kind of use in objects and the story behind the things that you come into contact with in your practice and the things that you choose to involve in your practice. And I wondered if you would speak a little bit about the materials that you used for this and your relationship with those things, particularly with painting onto the panels and in the other entitled work, painting onto that as well. And yeah, just speak a little bit about the material usage, I suppose, is what I mean to ask you.
Okay. Well, to start on that, they're oil paints, and the choice of oil paints is that you can change things. They're manipulative on a surface, so that's a very positive thing in terms of when your mind is trying to orchestrate images on a surface. So they're really fantasy, you know. They have roots, literally.
Yeah, they're, that's something that's kind of throughout
nature,
all of these.
in nature, but it's not real nature, other than the fact that I would be surrounded by it myself, and I would refer to certain things. But I think it's really about, I suppose, like slightly fantastical things that we see, you know, that are quite natural, but out of context become amazing. So that is, you know, there's a surreal kind of thread there. Back to sort of surrealism, I suppose. But yeah, so you were asking about this.
Untitled and Dogman, they're my favourite so far.
Well, yes.
You have to come up and look at Dogman after this and get it really up close. It's incredible.
It's really a crossover between myself and one of my dogs, called Ruthie. And I just, again, it was like a sensation in terms of, I suppose, my personal existence. I did have a dream that I thought she was a baby, actually, and not a dog. And because she used to sleep in the bed, and I must have been dreaming or something, or holding her hand, but it was like she had a real little hand.
That's so beautiful, but also like uncanny at the same time.
Totally. And she always was that kind of a dog anyway. So she kind of manifested herself then out through this image. Which is like, you know, overlapping. And yeah.
Have you, just out of interest, have you ever read the poet Mark Doty?
No.
I think his work would be of great interest to you. He writes quite a lot about his dogs. He's a collection called Underland, I believe. And it's, again, something that you've been talking about, like that connection to the landscape, but there is also kind of a dark element there. But any sorts of bits of levity that come into the poems that he writes, nearly always related to his dogs. Which is beautiful. They're really kind of like symbols of hope, I find, a lot of the time in literature and art, and it really kind of heartened me. And then even seeing that, is this Baba up above?
This is Babs.
Babs, I love that as well. Just there's just something so bright about that piece. Yeah,
she's so alert, and so she always was. You know,
they're kind of answering to something maybe we're not even so in tune with, and they're so in tune with the world around them,
and with us, as well as everything else they're involved in. At that point, it's just, you know, talking about literature, and you know, it's a poem, or no, it's a novella by Virginia Woolf called Flush. Which is about Elizabeth Barnett Brown's little spaniel that she travelled with. That kind of fascinated me early on in my career. I loved that whole idea. And then, you know, her life on top, Elizabeth Barnett Brown's, fascinated me as well. You know, it was very particular.
I need to go back and read this now. This kind of put an interest on me. Some great book recommendations happening today. But it's something that you just mentioned that I wanted to ask about as well, is kind of that grounding of your work and relationship to the natural world, natural cycles. I'm getting a great sense of like kind of a mycelium, like the interconnectedness of the natural world around us. And I think that's something I'm seeing quite a lot through like the roots, the branches, the trees, and even in Dogman here. I think it's something that a lot of us are thinking of with the release of The Last of Us as well at the moment. I don't know if you're familiar with that TV show that's come out, Post-Apocalyptic Society, where a fungus is kind of at the forefront. And this is kind of, it's made me think a lot of it. But for anybody who doesn't know, mycelium it's kind of like the interconnectedness of fungus and how it kind of speaks to each other under the earth, and it runs out in all these little veins and roots. And it reminded me a little bit of your work. And I wondered if you would speak a little bit about that, because I was also reading that you're interested in, the cycles of the seasons, natural kind of like imitations, and kind of organic materials and that sort of thing. So I really do get that surreal sense, but it is grounded in nature for me when I look at your work. There is that real sorts of realism here, even with the trees that come in. Are they Japanese maple trees, like the coral trees, it kind of looks
They're
like?
kind of related to lots of trees. They are trees, but they're also roots.
Yeah.
They're like roots going up in the air, which trees are. You know, they have a reverse and then into the soil.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And then this really highlights that system that you're talking about, things that kind of grow in a vein sense.
Yeah.
And they're all integrating here, you know. And then there's a very subtle relation back into the mirror, which is a kind of image of me.
That caught my eye earlier. I
Yeah.
couldn't see it when I looked at this
Yeah.
piece online.
Yeah.
And it really kind of seemed to me kind of like it's a reflection, but kind of like a doorway and almost kind of like a threshold.
Yes.
Which I found very interesting.
Yeah.
A sort of place where the real is meeting the magical, maybe kind of like an Irish thin place.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I found very fascinating.
Yeah, it definitely is a door to, like you're saying, in the mirror, and all of these activities again are interacting, because here is a kind of a representation of the venal system in the body, related to a kind of early illustration of it. It's the red, so you can see it has real feet here and here.
That's fascinating.
So it's looking in, like it and this are kind of joined as well.
Yeah. It's funny you said that about the vein system. I can really see that now. And it was also reminding me a little bit of like lungs and like bronchioles, and thinking back to like old biology classes in school, and drawing those long, thin kind of vein structures.
Yeah.
Your work as well, it's reminded me quite a lot at my first glance of a lot of Frida Kahlo's work, which I really love, because she does do that kind of venic system as well, and blending of like the self and the body and the landscape around her. And a lot of the time the backgrounds of her pieces are like as interesting and informative as to the person in the foreground. And this piece reminded me quite a lot of, I don't know if you're, I had to write it down because his name was so difficult to say, Giuseppe Arcimboldo. He has a series of paintings called Fruit Faces.
Oh, yes, I know them.
You know the ones? Another thing to Google, it's a series of portraits where it's just profiles of people's faces. They're quite old, and they're made up of like cucumbers and tomatoes for the eyes and all sorts of, and they're quite uncanny, but they're hyper realistic as well.
They are,
fascinating. Your dogman reminded me a little bit of that for some reason.
Yeah, I think I saw some of those. I think are they in Vienna?
Yeah, I've never seen them in person.
Yeah, I saw some there. I've seen them in a few different galleries, but they are fascinating. And they're not very big, but you know, they're bigger than what I'm doing there. They're about so. Again, very captivating. Yeah. I also think just in terms of visual things, like I had been fascinated by early anatomical drawings and the relationship that people had with them, because it was considered slightly irreverent to look at the body first. So they presented the body as it was showing you. So if you look at the early images, they're actually revealing their body to you. So it's more like they're giving you this opportunity. It's not about you looking at them, you know, as such. And I like that. I think it's a very considered kind of way.
And that's so true, like historically, like I'm no expert on art, but I remember learning about that the early anatomical studies were so tied with the still lifes, because that's like the best access that artists could get would be to go and study real life humans. There's a really wonderful written piece, a poem by Doireann na Gríofa, who wrote A Ghost in the Throat, where she talks about her time in medical studies, which she did for a while before finding poetry. And she's working with a cadaver, and she just has this moment of realization that the space between her and the other person and the whole world between them. It's a beautiful poem. But I'm really, there's nothing better than hearing an artist talk about their own work.
There's
Please continue.
There's a brilliant museum in Florence, anatomical. It's beautiful. It's amazing. It's a lot of the objects are very early in it. It's up near the Pitti Palace.
Great name.
No, is it the Pitti Palace? It's not the Pitti Palace. It's the Bobley Gardens.
I'm going to remember it as the Pitti Palace.
Yeah. Maybe it is. I don't know. It's a very daunting building. But there's this attachment, which is this museum, which is beautiful. And, you know, it's well worth going to if you're there.
Okay, I'll add it to my bucket list.
Yeah.
Might I read 2 more poems and then ask you some more questions? Would that be all right?
No, that's lovely.
Or try and pepper in the poems here. I brought a couple with me because I was trying to think about what might be the most suitable. I worked on this project a few years ago with 2 writers who are heavily involved with the visual art world. Jenny Brown, who's based in Texas, and Vanni Capildeo. Don't know if you've ever heard of them. They're based in the US as well. And we went into the Ulster Museum in Belfast when I was studying there to an exhibition called Changing Views. And it was really fun. It was my first experience with sort of being given the opportunity and the permission to like engage with visual art in that way and just write something. In Ekphrasis, there's quite a lot of ways of engaging with the art. You can write about it, you can respond to it, you can imagine what's happening beyond the frame, or you can just simply go through with description. So it's kind of really fun to like play around in that way, and it did sort of feel like painting in a sense. But I brought 2 very short poems from that time. And the first is written after a John Ruskin piece. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He was an artist and a geologist, which as well as that you might like him, polymath and a poet, and he's from the Victorian era. Yeah. But this was after a page from a sketchbook that was on show, and I was really taken with the unfinished quality of something. Like when we're in the artist space and we're in the exhibition space, like everything there is that sense of finality, finished, things are framed, they're done. And it's great to have that space, and I'd imagine as well as an artist to have it finished and it's there. But I was really taken in this instance with the idea that it was, imagine somebody coming and taking a page from your sketchbook and putting it on display, and you're like, no. So this is a very short poem about that, called Leaf from a Sketchbook. The season has just shifted and is difficult to trust spring to stick around. Like it's hard to read the words scrawled in Ruskin's sketchbook. Perpetual outline underneath. That is the privilege of distance, the cross-stitch of the Alps, dappled as an artichoke bulb suspended above the church spire, and weather vane piercing that valley of the mountain, blending blue into sky, weeping and white-tipped with snow or light from God's touch, the dark spot where the eye draws, maybe a stain, is shaded distinctly as the shadow of a cross. That one, when you're looking at a piece, I don't know if this happens to you when you're looking at other people's artwork, and there's so much to choose from here, but your eyes focus in on like one specific piece, and you find yourself staring at it, and everything else kind of, you're absorbed into the landscape of it, but everything else kind of falls away, and that's what happened to me when I looked at that leaf of the sketchbook. There was this little smudge, it looked like a smudge right beside where he had drawn this weather vane, and there was a very, very faint lines of notes that he was writing to himself that were like unfinished. And it was just a gorgeous sort of, felt like an invitation into that process of his. So it was really beautiful.
Yeah.
I'll read one more and I'll go back to asking you some questions. In that time, in that exhibition, there was another artist called Susanna Drury. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She did this really incredible print of the Giant's Causeway in 1739? And essentially it was a piece that was really significant in geography and history, and it was included in the encyclopedia, and it basically it brought like international interest in the Giant's Causeway as a formation, and it basically helped to prove that it was formed naturally, because until that point they thought maybe somebody had come in and literally carved it out of the stone. Her depictions of it were one of the things that helped scientists and fancy geography people come in and really study it and give it the time and reach that conclusion. But the interesting thing about it is whenever the images were included in the encyclopedia, she was not named and was never given, her dues for doing that work and spending time there and creating such a significant historical piece. And it's called East Prospect of the Giant's Causeway. So that's the same name of this poem. You painted a coast that could be cloud, caught a turning curd of milk, the whole sky in vellum. The calf skin pulled taut, awash with water and lime, went motley with the holding, all that basalt, igneous and magnesium rich. Cacophonous is the silence, aside shouts from fishers in the distance and the women in their long skirts. Pastel-clad and intrepid, they have occupied the columns and are refusing to move. They've gone cover to cover in the encyclopedia and are waiting for you to be credited. It feels very strange to read poems in response to artwork that isn't on show. So I can't encourage enough to go look at these pieces if you get time later on. It's kind of interesting as well, like that idea of and that's something I wanted to ask you about, the change in meaning and that transference in when a piece is created and what you are responding to as an artist and what it then becomes in the public space. And we as the laymen come to look at things and apply our own meaning. How do you find that experience when you're going from your internal place of inspiration and creation and then through to a space like this when it's on show and other people are interacting with it? How do you find that?
I think it's like part of, again, like the venal system of things coming through things and forming their own paintings. The paintings are made in a sort of a private world, but once they exist, then other people interact with them. And they will see, of course, other things, but also they will create other stories, so on and so forth. So other links are made. I don't want to control them that much, And I think it's better to leave the things there, if you know what I mean, and not define them too much.
Yeah.
Do you know?
I think it'd be really hard to define these in one swoop anyway, in the most incredible way.
Well, of course, and the reason why I think people want to view them is because they want to interact and to experience something themselves, which I think is very understandable. Like somebody, like you writing a poem, you're never going to be able to control fully what people think. And you've just created this space where people can interact with something you've done. And that's the kind of value, I think, of any art form, isn't it? You know, because it is a language within a language, you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right, and it's you really can't control it, but it is a really lovely thing to be able to do, and such a gift to be able to allow people to kind of step into the space and view your pieces and have their own reactions and experiences and kind of fall in love with the different aspects and be unnerved. And myself and Liz were talking about this earlier. When you're looking at this one, you kind of almost get a sense of like unsteadiness kind of on your feet as well, like because you're kind of like, it looks like kind of like maybe like a little island like floating.
Yes.
And you might fall in.
Yeah.
Which is amazing to like be able to have that sensation.
Sure.
Looking at something.
And it's full of, like, there are little holes around anyway. There's one under here.
Yeah. It's
So
like a marshland or a bogland or something.
And it's like a porous grounding, and you do inquire as to what's going on down there, but then you leave it. You know what I mean? Because up here is more dreamy and open, and just is kind of, it's more around sort of air, I suppose, that element.
Yeah.
And then the process here is just, again, it's just there's a process obviously going on here with the red roots, and they're being chopped up and they're being repotted. And again, it's a human element, that kind of process, that integration into, nature.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that boundary between the natural world and kind of like human involvement in the body and the self, it's very kind of like permeable is what I sense from like a lot of your work. Like it's kind of, and it's interesting that there are no people in any of these, but you really get the sense that they've maybe just moved out of the frame and that they're there.
the thing is that even I do paint figurative elements, people, but the problem with it sometimes is people just stay with it when it's another person. It's a kind of like, it's almost like a barrier in a way.
Yeah.
So I find that, even though I have and do use figures sometimes, but in relation to similar imagery.
Yeah. It's really fascinating that there being another person, and it kind of, we almost kind of get stuck to that. Maybe there's something like a reflection or something. And that I wanted to ask you one or two more questions. I think
Yes.
we must close up soon.
Okay.
And then I'm going to read one poem to
Sure,
close us
lovely.
out. So I've asked you about your pieces and the importance of the natural world. And yeah, the mycelium. I wanted to ask you a really, really specific question about something I read about one of your pieces of work. And it was that you were looking for this really, really specific color in a painting that you were writing, that you were doing, for a yellow rose at the center of a piece.
Okay.
And I read that you were looking all around for real life inspiration to find this specific yellow, and then you looked into your dog's mouth and found it. Is that true? I can't remember the name of the piece. I think it might have been an untitled piece, but
It wasn't. I think it's called Mahoney, that plant,
oh right,
and it has a red bark.
yeah.
Am I right?
You're the expert.
Well, it's got a yellow interior,
Okay.
and there is an image that I worked. It's like a floating piece of vellum with
Okay.
this image on it. What did you want to ask me? Sorry.
I suppose it was just about how you apply that process of finding inspiration, really, I suppose, in your real life, your surroundings. You're saying that you're surrounded by the natural landscape,
Yes.
your dogs, how you derive and translate, I suppose, those things into paintings. And that was one example, that the finding
Okay.
of specific colors, because I'm very interested in like the specificity of colors
Yeah.
used for things. So that yellow was something that struck me.
Yes, that's what that would have had a reference to. Now, I have a small garden, which I garden, and I like doing it. I'm not saying I'm an expert, but I like interacting with plants and growing, and the whole idea of soil and stuff like that. It's almost very important for me. It kind of balances me, and as anybody knows from working in gardening, like that, it's a sort of form of meditation in a way, because it clears your mind.
Yeah.
And you're just very physically involved. A little like painting, I suppose, at times, because you do become, you're absent of thoughts.
Yeah.
There's something going out in front of you, and then that is the interaction, and that's enough. You know what I mean? At that time, you don't want to complicate things, and then things get, I suppose, into knots. But so it's a very much an important thing for me and my translation. And in terms of, just to extend that, in terms of these and paintings and how I work them, was that I usually start from I draw things first. It's really important for me to do that, because if I start working on the painting itself, I find, and I assume in a way, that people are going to get confused. So I like to have maybe there's a grid there somewhere, but of course it extends beyond that once the process starts as a painting.
Yeah.
But there is an early stage there. I mean, it was a lot to do with viewing the Northern Renaissance and all Van Eyck and all of those people. I was fascinated by, the process there and how, they had cartoons which they kept, and they sold their cartoons if somebody bought their studio, let's say if they passed away, people bought those, and a lot of them were things like of the Madonna and things, and you'll notice that through looking at images at that time. A lot of them are very similar in composition because people would have bought them, and they were replicated quite a lot, and that's quite a fascinating thing in itself.
That it really is, and I'm really struck by. I think it's a very good point for us to end up at as well, like that process of from the beginning to the finished piece, that process of kind of, I guess, what would be flow that you're talking about, and getting into that sort of feeling of like you're almost kind of channeling something, you're tapping into something, there's a well that you're drawing from. I think that happens in writing and in artwork and all of the creative streams. Like there's a point to when you feel like you're making good work, where you're working with your hands or you're writing, and there's almost kind of like a non-consciousness happening. It just feels like it's kind of running through you, and hearing you talk about that, starting with your blocking and then it expands. Like that's what it made me think of, and it just sounded really fascinating and interesting. It's great to hear more about that process and how organic it is. And yeah, it does seem like it feels like you're tapping into kind of like this dream world that's out there, and you're bringing back little pieces for us to look at, but it maybe exists out there on its own.
Well, both.
Yeah. I might read one final poem to finish, and then if anybody has any questions for us about your lovely pieces, we might do that. I'm going to go off book because I had some poems here that I was going to read, but just in talking about colours, I have one that I want to read instead. So when I was doing this pamphlet, I got really obsessed with the colour green, and still really am. If anybody has read Maggie Nelson's Bluettes, they'll kind of know how I feel about falling in love with a specific colour. And I wrote a series of poems about specific hexanomical colours of green. And the first ever green poem I wrote was after Federico Garcia Lorca, who's a Spanish poet who's also very interested in the arts. So I thought I might end this there, because it also ties back into the natural world and that process of finding inspiration. The good kind of green. As children, we ate leaves and let on there were anything else. That heat of believing, swimming out to kiss your thinning digits, I was happy to get it wrong, mistook your waving for a drowning, foregrounding the sun set into a thumbprint. Your steady gaze above the waves was a stilled field of eyebright. It locked me in an uncertainty of cool tones. Artichoke, bitter, bud, cabbage, citrus, cucumber, dill, Douglas fir, eucalyptus, evergreen, grass, kale, kiwi, lake, leek, lime peel, mint, moss, Nile, nori, olive pea, pear, peppermint, poison, irie, prairie, reef, sea mist, shisho, silt, snow pea, soft moss, spearmint, spinach dip, surf spray, sweet pea, tender yellow tinted mint, treetop, undersea, your hand creeping up the inner seam of my wide-legged slacks, the heavy duster folded away for summer, the stout pen lifted from the bookies, quick twisting my pubic hair with the garden gate hiccuping after you, all in the same breath. Verde, quiete quero verde. You wake to go quietly, your shadow hangs hungry in the doorway, known from the inside. And that's us.
I love the variance of green.
Well, I have a copy for you actually, which I will. You can take with me. If anybody is interested, you can get copies of the pamphlet in books upstairs in Dublin or online, and it's also widely available in the UK. So my publisher's based there. That's for you. Take it with you.
Love it. Thanks.
Have you anything else to say?
Yeah, that was wonderful, Jess and Michael. really interesting
Thank you.
correlations there, especially with that last poem. And before we open up to the audience, I'm sure there are some questions for you. Michael, this body of work was from your 2005 show, and thankfully we had the forthrightness at the time to purchase this work for the collection, which we're thrilled to have, and the other works were bought by, sadly no longer with us, David Cunningham, but that was in his collection, the 3 works that are on long-term loan to us. And the meticulousness of these works would always strike people, how long they take for you. I know this kind of work, you've continued to make paintings in this vein, and that that you don't produce a huge amount of work, that you take a long time, and especially from visits to your studio to see those pencil works that actually don't get shown.
No.
And then maybe as a guide, because you could get lost in that landscape and not and go down a road and never come back again. But those drawings help to anchor you within the painting. What kind of work, I mean, thematically or idea-wise, have you continued since then? Is it the same, looking to nature and to your beloved animals, and are those relationships continued to this day?
Yes, really. Variants within that, but they're very much centered around nature and, as you say, and animals of all description. They would be found, I suppose, accidentally sometimes. They might be killed. They might have been things that have been killed by the dogs or a cat or something. So, but they fascinate me just as much, not in a repulsed way at all. Yes, plants, the idea, but also I think in the last while it's been things like dead plants that have died, things that have died in containers, like pots and things. I quite like something about that, and it kind of relates a little bit then to something that I saw. It was a Van Gogh, still lifes, little ones, tiny ones, of things like that, and I quite liked them, of the sort of insignificance, I suppose, of the things themselves. So there is an element of that creeping in there.
And is your garden always an influence? Because I know that your garden is actually pretty spectacular. He's quite modest about his garden, but it is
playing it
amazing
down.
what you've done with your garden, the city garden. It's really amazing. Do you look to that always too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, even when it's in its dead state, and prior to it being tidied up after the winter, there's something fascinating about how nature looks after things itself, and how, again, it's intermingling and how it breaks down, and it will always resume when weather comes. It's like, I always think of, we're always concerned about our dwelling and things, but like plants will attach themselves to it and start growing, they just keep on doing it. And if we didn't control it, actually, they'd be growing everywhere, a bit like this, they're busy working all the time. So, yeah.
It's amazing. And now you spent many years of your life teaching. You've been
Yes.
a beloved teacher to many in WIT.
CIT now, is it? What's it called now?
Yay! Past students like there, maybe?
Yeah.
And you're about to retire pretty soon,
Yes.
which you must be thrilled about, and I will be fascinated to see what that time will present to you. Are you
Sure.
looking forward to spending more time painting?
Well, yes. I mean, I loved teaching all the time. That was it's part of my life, a big part of it. But I feel it's time for me to move on and just have a simpler thing going on, and less engagement. But yes, one would have interacted with the other, of course, and sustained something for, I think I worked out nearly 40 years. So that's a long time,
It's The life changes. The next chapter will be interesting to watch.
Yeah, hopefully.
I'm sure, Liz, I don't know if we have any questions for Jess.
It's interesting. It's very interesting your line of questioning of Michael and the kind of the depth and the real kind of rigor which you brought to this interview. So I'm going to ask you now. I mean, what in looking at this work and in asking these questions of Michael, are there areas of common ground between your process and the making of your work and Michael's?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. You're probably articulating things that sometimes it's hard to articulate things about your own work, and then you can speak so happily about other people's and so readily.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there are quite a lot of areas of common ground. I think you'll see in the pamphlet there's a series of poems in there as well that are about common wildflowers that are around the area in Donegal, where I spent quite a lot of lockdown, and I was finishing the manuscript. And we could only go in the 2K radius, and I was just writing about the things around me and finding that kind of organic inspiration process. But I was, again, fascinated by kind of the resilience of what a lot of people see as weeds. And some of those flowers are the most beautiful to me, like, common gorse and things like that. And I am really fascinated by the cycles, but also, their resilience in the ways that they keep on even when everything else around them has stopped. It doesn't really impact them at all. And I find that kind of really fascinating and truly beautiful. So I wrote quite a lot about that. I think the natural cycles, the natural world, I think you're potentially beating me on the spooky scale with but I want to do more like that. I kind of quite interested in quite a lot of trees and folklore. I don't know if that ever, do you ever find like historical and folklorist aspects would ever inform your work?
Well, yes, depending. Yeah, when I come across something, there's, again, it wasn't in Ireland, but in Assisi, I went to see the tree where the Sermon of Birds of St. Francis.
Oh, wow.
It exists. It's praised. How real it is due to the whole medieval thing, who knows? But if you go in with that intention, it's quite amazing. Just to see it, because it was near his hermitage, and that still exists. So and it's a tree, like, because it's all in the Giotto paintings. You'll see of him talking to the birds, which is a lovely idea.
Incredible.
Anyway,
I'm doing a lot of research at the minute into bird lore, which I've just discovered is a thing that you can do, and encapsulating quite a lot of that. But trees are just sort of an endless source of wisdom, and I'm always really drawn to them as well. My grandfather is he was a horticulturist and is retired now, and is a tree grafter. He's always kind of creating these sorts of he could grow trees together, like 2 or 3 different types and species of trees, and they create new trees, and it's really, really fascinating. He's been doing that forever.
Is it kind of like grafting them?
Yeah, that's what he does now. So he's always got experiments going on in the back garden when I go home. So I find that I'm always really drawn to the natural world around me, but specifically trees. But
it's a kind of art form in itself, isn't it? I mean, the whole idea of recreating.
Yeah.
That's
beautiful. I never thought about it that way. That's really beautiful.
Photographed over there by an artist there in that display case.
Oh yes.
Oh, yeah.
Against the wall beside Nina Gorey's painting.
Oh, with the horse hair?
Yep.
Yeah, that's very good.
Well, maybe we should open it up to the audience. I'm sure there might be somebody in there that has a question. So yes, Barbara.